Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer and welcome to another of our Sociology of Media Voices series. Today we're going to have a real deep dive into the area of cannabis and specifically what is cannabis, why we need to consider legalising cannabis in Australia across all states. And we're going to also talk about some of the misinformation that seems to be littered around through the media. And luckily enough today, we are very fortunate to have somebody who is an authority in this space. That is Dr. Brain Walker. Now, he is a politician. He is a medical practitioner before he entered politics. And at the 2021 Western Australian state election, Dr. Walker was elected to the Western Australian Legislative Council as a Legalise Cannabis WA member for the East Metropolitan Region, and his term commenced on May 2021. Now, this incredible person was born in Malaysia to Scottish parents, so he's very adverse with diversity, and was educated at Scotch College, Perth, prior to studying medicine at the University of Dundee. Since graduating, he has since practiced medicine in Germany, Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom and Hong Kong, returning to Perth in 2008 to set up a specialist GP practice in Perth Hills. And I read it off the Wikipedia because I wanted everyone to realise or to be aware that this person has been around. Like, he's gone all different countries. He's looked at, obviously, the issue quite closely. So he brings a wealth of experience. Welcome, Dr. Brain, to TASA.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So let's start the journey. You're part of a party that's called the Legalise Cannabis. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Let's start there.
Well, I first got involved with the party basically because I was angry. As a prescribing general practitioner in Perth, I found so many barriers to my ability to prescribe for people in need of a good, healthy, healing herb, which is about the safest medication I can prescribe in my pharmacopoeia. So I got in contact with the party, stood for Parliament, and here I am. So when people ask me, why did I go into politics? The answer is anger. I really wanted to help people I couldn't help in a one-on-one in my clinic.
And I guess being a medical practitioner, did you have any sorts of ethical or legal issues because you were such a supporter of this this area that seems to be controversial to some degree?
That's an interesting question. I have to go back for the answer, back to 1982 in Germany, when I left my clinic in tears. Because for not one single diagnosis I'd made that day, and there was many diagnoses, for not one diagnosis could I give an underlying cause. So I left in tears because I thought to myself, I'd saved more people as a sort of lifesaver in Perth than I had as a doctor. Because if you haven't got the fundamental cause of disease sorted, all you're doing is putting a plaster on a symptom, and that upset me. So I began a process there of looking, reevaluating what health and medicine and wellness is all about. And it became very apparent to me then, all those years ago, that in medicine, we don't actually deal with wellness at all. And this means that we're managing disease to death. Now, hit by a taxi, good, we can do things to keep you alive, to undo the damage or repair the damage done. But for the general health issues, diabetes, hypertension, renal disorders, we really haven't got to grips with the fundamentals. And the biggest area is autoimmune disease. We suppress the immune system, but don't ask, why is the immune system behaving like this? What can we do to change this? And so I grew up with the idea in medicine that we're very far off the mark. Now, with cannabis, we had learned, it's a dangerous drug, it's addictive, it can kill people, it causes psychosis. None of that's true. And so if that is a lie that we have been taught and are propagating, where else are we dealing with untruths in medicine? And it's important because people's lives do depend on it. So when I began prescribing cannabis, I began to realize there's an extensive problem here. We are, as doctors, led by a pharmacological industry to the benefit of pharmacology, but not to the benefits of the people we serve.
So let's start by saying, what is cannabis and how, so we can really understand it.
Well, cannabis is basically a plant, a healthy healing herb. There's many varieties of cannabis. We can't ever say there's one cannabis. It's a whole strata of different cannabinoids. And in that plant, there's about 500 different structures, but 80 cannabinoids in approximately, and terpenes as well. And this plant has for thousands of years been used as a healing herb. It has a number of medicinal properties. It has a number of spiritual properties too. It's been used to help people get into a different space in their mind, which is why it's actually so fraught in Western society. It's got a mind-altering substance. It must be dangerous. No, but it's been used medicinally for since time immemorial. In fact, cannabis was one of Queen Victoria's favorite medicines for her abdominal pains. In fact, I do believe she had troubles with endometriosis, possibly, and cannabis is a very good treatment for that. And it wasn't until the 1930s that cannabis was a regular part of medicinal treatment. In those days, of course, it was very much what symptoms can we manage with this, and it's very much a kind of try this and see if it works, and it does work very nicely. But since the prohibition, we haven't been able to study it, but now, especially Professor Raphael Meshulam, he began in Israel the research into cannabis, and we've got an endocannabinoid system affecting almost every organ in the body with remarkable possible effects in our wellness. And so cannabis as a healing plant can be used for a variety of things, classically for pain, also for anxiety, two very common things, but also autism, Alzheimer's disease, things like Parkinson's disease, and I'm using it for ADHD as well. There's a wide variety of potential uses.
Now, some of us have probably seen on the news and that, like in America, they have legalized licenses where people can then be allowed to purchase forms of cannabis for medicinal purposes. From your experience, is that something that that type of system you would want to see across Australia?
Well, we do have it legalized across Australia in medicinal form. People ask, what's the difference between recreational and medicinal use? There's no difference really. But the advantage of the legalized cannabis sources is that the growth has been regulated, and therefore it's cleaner, it's measurable, and it's safer as well. If you grow cannabis illicitly, especially under criminal control, they can use chemicals you don't really want to have in your body. So having a clean supply, I think, is very useful. As indeed all things, the vegetables you eat, they should be clean as well, not polluted with toxic chemicals. Same thing for cannabis.
So I think that's the first myth, isn't it? We've just dispelled that the difference between cannabis, which is regulated, where you grow, that's natural, and that you don't use any insecticides, that isn't controlled in the sector, in the criminal spaces at the moment, where they're using that to sell the product. So for people at the moment, can you maybe explain, where is cannabis used in medicine today in Australia at the moment?
They've done studies as to why is it prescribed. Things like commonly for pain, commonly for mental health issues, anxiety, depression less so, although it is very useful for that. PTSD, a very useful substance there. I mentioned chronic pain, but also the non-cancer pain and also cancer pain, very useful, and the nausea in cancer treatments. Those are the commonest uses, I would think, for cannabis. The other areas are still, we're investigating that. We did actually a parliamentary visit to a number of countries, including Israel. And in Israel, they're very, very scientific. They're extracting the individual cannabinoids and terpenes and testing them on individual patients and diseases to see what works, what doesn't. But they're actually treating ovarian cancer. They're treating it with a combination of 74% THC, 25% CBD, and 1% CBG. And I do believe they're getting good results with that. So that's an area of intense research. We've known for a long time that cannabis can have an influence on treating cancer. I've got personal experience in my clinic with that as well. So, but there's also a vast area of unknowns. There's a friend of mine, Moshe Myers, a PhD coming on in neuropsychopharmacology, PhD candidate. And he can give you chapter and verse on the biochemistry of that and the pharmacology. And the potential for that is immense. But the learnings we've got from our studies in cannabis and cannabinoids is immense. And we're just scratching the surface just now.
Mm. And what about the forms? Because for some people who may not know, there's this assumption that it's something that's inhaled through the cigarette form. Is that, let's talk a bit about that. How can cannabis be taken in terms of a therapeutical approach to health and well-being?
Very sensible. Look, I'm a rabid anti-smoker, rabid. I've detested smoking since I was 5 years old. And I can tell you now that smoking cannabis is the worst way of taking cannabis. It's probably the commonest way illicitly, but it's the worst way. Combusting a plant, you get products of combustion which are not good for your health. If you use pure cannabis without any tobacco, it's safer than using tobacco mixed in with your cannabis. But even then, I'd be reluctant to do that. So the typical light up a joint is not something I can recommend. We can also use the cannabis to make it into edibles. Your cookies, your brownies, this kind of thing has been classically used. In fact, there's lovely medical marijuana. It's a pharmacopoeia. So there's a number of books there which teach you how to use this as a medicine. And it gives wonderful recipes for very tasty foods made with cannabis, each for a different purpose, often treating yourself socially. But the pharmacological companies developing cannabis as a product, it started out making an oil, an edible, if you like, an oil, and that's the commonest way just now. That's moved on to offering dried herb, which can be taken through a dried herb vaporizer, which is a lot safer than smoking, dried herb vaporizer. We could move on and use an oil extract of cannabis, which can be vaporized as well, without those chemicals which are dangerous. My personal favorite is actually the resin, the heat and pressure extracted resin, which is then vaporized. And you can use that as a fairly immediate response to treatment for using cannabis. We're developing capsules, where capsules have always been available, and also wafers. And we're thinking about, the pharmacological companies are thinking about developing sprays, like an asthma spray, which might be useful as well. But that's still awaiting development.
So you mentioned Israel was a country that you were quite impressed with the way they're going forward. Are there any other spaces that you feel that we would benefit from maybe further investigating or becoming partnerships with a country that's established and has set ways of doing things?
Well, Israel, of course, is leading the world when it comes to many things in science, including cannabis. But my personal favorite is my old home, Germany. They are legalizing cannabis this year, but they're doing it in typical German fashion. They've got the UN single convention on drugs. They've adapted that to fit the German law. They've looked at European law, EU law, and brought that into the German sphere. So they've managed to allow the German legislation to encapsulate the difficulties around the UN and the EU to make that legal within Germany. And then, that's a legal structure. Then under that, they've got their own, I suppose, a pharmaceutical company, which is government-led, which has all the cannabis from outside coming in, the homegrown or the imported cannabis from where it's distributed, either as recreational cannabis or as medicinal cannabis. So they've got a structure there which is really solid, an example for the world, and I think we should copy that.
And what about the idea about people being able to then grow it at home so that they can, or is that not sort of on the table when it comes to legalizing this therapeutic drug?
Well, absolutely it is. Now, I made before the distinction, there's no distinction between recreational and medical use of cannabis. Growing your own medicine, I think, is fantastic. You can grow mint leaves. You can grow your own vegetables, which is useful for a healthy nutrition. We can grow our own herbs, which also have medicinal benefit. Cannabis is no different. The improvement with homegrown, first of all, it's cheaper. Secondly, you can control what's going in. The criminals, they don't care what they're using. They want the larger supply. They put the chemicals in to get a larger bud, which is bad for your health. They don't care. They'll mix it with other things like a methamphetamine to make it addictive to people so they can get more customers. Criminal grown, illicitly grown cannabis is not good at all. And the quality can be very variable. You grow your own. If you're interested in healthy food, growing it in your own space would be an excellent idea. And you can use that. Did you know, for example, that the cannabis leaf with the acid form of the cannabinoids can prevent the COVID-19 virus spike protein from coming into your cells? So imagine using that leaf rather than kale in your green smoothie. That would be a health food. So homegrown cannabis absolutely is on our agenda.
A lot of interesting, isn't it, that we're looking at going back to centuries of way people were healing and wellness. And I really love that, because it's really taking that, for me, it's that using those indigenous ways of knowing and using what we have from our environment in a way that's worked for thousands of years. And I guess it's challenging people to think that, you know, just because someone says you can't do it, you've got to look at the reasoning why. So let's say, why do some people have such a problem with regulating and using cannabis for me? What do you see in your role, and you being in part, do you hear around you that what are I guess say the main three reasons, or however you want to say that, the key reasons why people are firmly against it?
Well, our select committee did travel extensively and listened to the people who are growing, selling and using. One of the things we heard constantly in Australia and in Europe and in Israel, the constant refrain is we need more education. We need to educate doctors, we need to educate the public, we need to educate politicians, because there's a lot of untruths flying around. Now, this stems from the 1930s. The reason cannabis was banned was not because of any medical reason. In fact, the majority of medical advice was cannabis is safe, don't ban it. There was 39 doctors asked by the FBI, 38 said it's perfectly safe, 1 said it should be banned. And at that time, cannabis, then called marijuana, was banned by the FBI because it was a xenophobic, racist attitude, so that they could actually arrest and persecute the blacks and the Hispanics in the southern states of America. And even now, it's used as a political tool. Back in the 60s, the anti-Vietnam War hippies, who were very much into cannabis, they were actually portrayed as communist, anti-American cannabis smokers. And that gave the government the right to arrest them, to imprison them, to persecute them, in fact. Same thing for using heroin, by the way. The blacks were castigated as being heroin users. You could arrest them, you could search them, you could actually do all kinds of nasty things to the apartheid era US politics. So drug policy actually really wasn't based on wellness at all. It was actually all politics and control of money and control of people's thoughts. And what we have had over the last 18, 90 years is, in fact, a propaganda, a lie being told often enough. For example, the reefer madness. Cannabis will give you psychosis. Cannabis will let your women congregate with black men. Cannabis will do all kinds of horrible things to you. And it's been repeated again and again and again. And so now it's become part of our so-called knowledge. So now in Parliament, I'm trying to undo decades of negative propaganda, asking for the science to be listened to. And people aren't listening to the science. They're fixing themselves on the propaganda, the negative lies, and the science which is there, they're not seeing. It's really amazing to watch.
And that's sort of interesting, isn't it? That when you just mentioned that, people are more comfortable sitting in a propaganda space than actually listening to the science, you know, and the evidence. So there is something happening there, isn't there? There's some people are fixated on this cultural control.
I was listening yesterday to a lovely talk by Greg Copley, a very eminent Order of Australia man of great knowledge, who was talking about a variety of things in the Asian Australian realm and the US. And he was saying that these days, our society is ruled by rumor. We're dealing with things on rumor. Our internet-based life, we can spread any misinformation, disinformation. It's very difficult to get truth. And that really is part of our problem. How do you get facts out there which are not manipulated? How do you actually know what is real? The AI forms out there pretending to be news anchors, reading out misinformation that people say, oh, but it's on, I've read this, it's true, it must be true. So we have a problem with getting truth listened to.
And it's about also, wellness and quality of life, which sometimes we don't, or sometimes the people who oppose this don't really talk about or understand. And for me, as somebody who has lived through the 80s, and I was there where I lost a lot of friends and lovers from AIDS-related illnesses. And even in that time, I remember people who were, at the ending of the life were using cannabis as a way to make that process a little bit more comfortable. And it seemed to really help. So I saw it with my own eyes and witnessed it as a way that it relieved a lot of pain that people were in, and it seemed to calm people down. And I'm just wondering, I know I've started stepping a little bit, because of what happened in that era, why did we not, as a society, pick up at that? People dying of AIDS-related illnesses, and it obviously is quite clear a lot of people were using it, that people didn't say, oh my God, this is what we should use to help people or to make people feel comfortable.
It's a fascinating question, and I really don't know. I do have experience, however. I remember I lived many years in Germany, and very, very dear German friends. And of course, in those years, in the 80s, a lot of people had direct experience of the Nazi regime. In fact, parents of friends of mine had been at the famous Goebbels speech at the end of the war. Do you want the total war? Have you ever heard of that speech? Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Do you want the total war? The end of the war was there. The war had been lost. Every single day was more wasted blood, more wasted life. It was over, it was finished. And Goebbels got up there in front of this large audience saying, do you want the total war? Of course, they said, no, we're tired, it's time to stop. By the end of the speech, though, his rhetoric was fantastic. By the end of the speech, every single one stood up there, gave the Nazi salute and said, yes, we want the total war. They were transformed by the propaganda, by the manipulation of a very clever orator. We have the same thing now. And you can motivate people with a number of very firm but very solid and ancient principles. One of the most important ones is fear. Now, HIV at that time, an unknown virus coming through, killing people indiscriminately, that was causing fear and panic. I was a doctor in Germany as the HIV pandemic came through, and we weren't allowed to take blood to check an ESR without giving a consultation, because had there been evidence for inflammation, it might have indicated HIV positive. You might have been so shocked you would have killed yourself. Therefore, we can't take any blood until you've been counseled. I went, wow. Wow. So fear and panic, and you can control people using fear. That's a very powerful motivator. And we have the same thing with cannabis. It will cause psychosis. I don't dare take that. That's a lie. But it's a fearfully frightening lie. I don't want to be psychotic. And therefore, cannabis is something I can't take. So I'll happily take your heroin derivative, but cannabis, oh no, I can't take that. It might cause psychosis. So we're manipulated by mistruths. And now people might propagate them with a sense of this is the right thing to do, or it might be because they have bad intentions and using this deliberately to mislead people. But the end effect is the same. We are inhibited in doing what we feel to be right because we're afraid of possible consequences. A bit like in religion saying, if you do this, you'll go to hell. That's a horrible place there, so don't do this.
So with you being over the landscape of research, have you identified any gaps in research space that we should be thinking about, or that you feel you really think that we should really look at now to help position the use of cannabis?
I keep saying follow the science, and I do mean this very sincerely, but science can be manipulated too. So we need to have some review of how do we do our science. The evidence we've got for the efficacy of cannabis is still not as strong as I would like it. In my experience, I see people coming to me saying, my life has been transformed. I can live again. I feel so much better. But when we look at this in the forms of a scientific double-blind placebo-controlled study, we're not seeing these changes as strongly evidenced as I experience in my daily life. So I'd like to see better controlled studies to look specifically at what cannabis can and indeed cannot do for you. I always say cannabis is not a universal panacea. It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't. But what does it affect? If you go back to the endocannabinoid system, which I love that, if you get a chance to do some research online, the endocannabinoid system is well worth spending some time. Discovered in 1996 and still not taught in medical schools. Still, it's being hidden from us, but it's out there. We know this now. And we've got CB1 and CB2 receptors. There's possibly 3 and 4. We're still working on that, not me, but the scientific community. So I'd like to see more research done into that. How does it specifically work? What can we do to enhance that? If we're balancing the homeostasis of the body in the endocannabinoid system, what are we going to do? Can it affect blood pressure? What's the effect going to be on, for example, cancer, one of our major problems? Gut health is a major source of chronic ill health. And we're not really looking at, can we, for example, use a cannabis extract, say we can dehydrate the cannabis plant and have all of the cannabinoids in a water form, which you can swallow. Apparently, it's very good for sorting out chronic gut issues. And that's something that we haven't really begun to look at. So there's a lot of research yet to be done. But what we need is funding for the research. We're needing open-minded people, because did you know that the observer bias can affect the end result of the study? So 2 similar studies, one thinks it'll work, one thinks it won't work. You'll have different study results. And this is a major problem. So we need to look at the science, revisit that, and just deepen our knowledge of cannabis, the biochemical structures and the receptors and the end effects in the body. This is where Israel, I think, is leading the world, by the way.
And in terms of in Australia at the moment, where are we in terms of, now the difficulty is, of course, we have different states and that, so can you maybe give the listeners a bit about the positionality of the legalisation spaces of cannabis in Australia at the present time?
Well, first of all, there's no state where legalisation is on the cards. All of the premiers and first ministers are against that. They see no reason for legalising cannabis. And that's an area that we really ought to be attacking. This just makes no sense at all. Cannabis is, there's a paper I laid on the table in Parliament, 114 times safer than alcohol. That's freely available, causing immense amounts of destruction in our communities, both rural and metropolitan, immense destruction, and it's allowed freely. Whereas cannabis, which is far safer, is banned. And this is true in every state. Legalizing medicinal cannabis is also variable. The different states have different values. For example, in Western Australia, the government here is exceptionally conservative, stupidly so. And up until now, there's a maximum of 40 milligrams of THC per day before we need specialized advice. And the specialists are less educated than I am. I need to defer to a psychiatrist who may never have prescribed cannabis in his life to get his permission to increase the dose for his patient. This is stupid. Whereas in the eastern states, we can have well above 100. It's not a problem. We titrate upwards to what you need, not what the government says you can have. And this is so the different states have got different levels. Generally, Queensland's got probably more liberal laws, so it's easier to access cannabis there, as we see by the number of prescriptions in Queensland are higher than in other states. And so the availability is easier there. People then say, but drug addicts are going to want to get scripts for cannabis. I say, well, no, they're not, because it's cheaper to grow your own or to use illicit cannabis. So I don't have any problem at all with illicit drug seekers at all. So the reason for restricting it is actually not there.
And I think you've really highlighted to us some really things to consider. If people want to know more about, I guess, even becoming involved in the work that you do, and understand, or even to kind of unpack some of the ideas of the party, we'll put the web link to your party. So what's the official title? What's the official party called?
Well, we have actually a federal body, Legalise Cannabis Australia, but each state has its own body as well. I am the leader of the Legalise Cannabis Party in Western Australia. And we have that in South Australia, in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland. I'm not sure about Tasmania and Northern Territory. I must check on that. They're not on my radar at the moment. ACT, of course, has decriminalized all drugs, including cannabis. And that's lovely, but there's limitations there as well. So we're moving gradually in the right direction. In Legalise Cannabis WA, my policy is there's three things that I focus on. One is truth. Not just the truth about cannabis, but where else does government not tell us the truth? There's many examples of that. And so cannabis I use as a flag. We want the truth out there, including for cannabis. The second platform is freedom. Now, I would like to be a free man in a free country, a free woman in a free country, and we're not. The freedom I define as being able to do what I want, how I want, when I want, provided no one else is hurt. That is my idea of freedom. If I want to climb a mountain, I will. If I fall off, I know I might fall off, but I want to be able to climb that mountain. You can't tell me not to climb that mountain. And it's the same thing with anything here. I want to be able to ride my e-scooter, for example, provided I hurt no one else. And if I do things which will result in people being hurt, that should be regulated. So that's freedom. It's not a free-for-all. It's not anarchy. It's sensible legislative freedom. And the last platform here is growth. And this is actually a bit of a poke at the establishment. It's not growth of cannabis alone. It's spiritual growth, physical growth, financial growth, economic growth. All these things are important. So being able to grow, there's three areas in society we need to focus on: education, agriculture, and wellness. And those areas need to grow as well.
Dr. Brain Walker, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing you speak so passionately and really positioning the truths as I see them about cannabis and how it could impact and give ourselves a sense of quality of life that we all really, as you said, deserve the right to have. A herb that's been around for centuries, it's been used for centuries, and we need to consider and maybe deep think, why is it being so controlled? Who are the voices that aren't being heard? And who are the voices that are controlling it? And what are the reasons behind it? And whose interests are being served? Thank you so much for spending some time with us today for Voices Sociology of Media.
It's a pleasure.